Hello, everybody. I've been quiet for a while. Welcome. So I've been talking a lot recently about topics related to insight, the intellect, and abstraction. And of course, I'm very concerned about particular issues, especially for modern human beings, because we live in something resembling anti-societies that are masquerading as actual societies. And our situation in language is dire for most of us. We are not trained to understand the dangers or the opportunities that our habits and modern proclivities set up for us and reward and punish and so on. So these are deep and abiding concerns for me. And obviously I face them in my own thought and speech and writing all the time. And what I mean by face them is experience them. I experience, it might seem that because I can articulate my concerns, that I must be free of these things. This is not the case. Most of these problems have trenchant effect on my own thought and experience and existence. And as a writer and somebody who's fascinated by the possibilities of articulation, language, and thought, I'm constantly encountering my own habits. And because we're human, our habits are contagious. There's a social space where habits such as the use of filler words, for example, like, or you know, or right, become transmissive, right? We receive them. We are animals who learn by emulation. And so to differing degrees, we're prone or inclined to emulate behaviors that we encounter in our daily experience, whether that's of sitcoms on television or Vedic gurus on YouTube. So we all have these natural inclinations, and we each experience them uniquely in various circumstances. For human beings, there's a feature that I refer to as the human cognition, a feature of the world. And this is the network of human minds. And we might imagine that this network has only physical, concrete transports. But this does not appear to me to be true. The network has subtle, non-physical transports of all kinds that we're either inclined to not talk about or believe in, or we're inclined to form metaphysical fictions about. I'm not a huge fan of either of those behaviors. I think something very profound and astonishing is going on. And it's so profound and astonishing that our common ways of thinking and framing things don't work well. They may be completely ill-suited to exploring these matters. We're almost completely. So over the past few videos, I've talked about problems with abstraction and generalization. Ironically, both abstraction and generalization are involved in my ability to perceive these problems. And when I'm speaking abstractly about abstraction, or when I'm generalizing about generalization, hopefully we can all see the irony there. The way that my concerns fold back upon my concerns and produce something that is at least superficially paradoxical. Today, I want to talk a bit about the way of knowing we commonly refer to with a vast, oversimplified generalization. One word: science. Now, there are different ways of knowing. There are somatic ways of knowing, the flavor of food, the feeling of a kiss. There are representational ways of knowing, the study of history or religion or science. There are dreaming ways of knowing, the feelings and experiences and perspectives and perceptions that we have in dreams. There is art, music, dance, acting, painting, drawing. There are practical ways of knowing and technical ways of knowing, such as the knowledge that a fisherman has of her tackle, the water, the habits of fish, how to trigger their striking or eating behavior, how to take advantage of that. Hunters have a different way of knowing. Birders, people, twitchers who pay very close attention to birds, have a way of knowing. There are the branches of the sciences: biology, physics, astronomy, so on. So there are many ways of knowing, and it's easy to forget this, or to not pay attention to it. So today, I think I want to talk a bit about science and its relationship with abstraction and derivation, with closing the space so that relatively objective understandings of the function of various aspects of phenomena that we can distinguish become utilitarianly successful, right? We can utilize them in various ways to predict things, to understand statistical probability, to understand physics, biology, the minute functions of cells and organelles, animals and genes, viruses and bacteria. And all of my life, I've been an aficionado of science in general. The hummingbird's feathers are in an exact correspondence with the rays of the sun, so that feathers that are ordinarily black from one angle light up bright magenta in another. The scientific ways of knowing are among the most powerful ways of knowing that our modern societies have produced. They are powerful in lots of different ways. Fundamentally, however, they are powerful in producing physical and mathematical technologies that we presently find ourselves surrounded by, dominated by, and immersed in. I don't have a specific issue with science as a way of knowing. As I've made clear in previous videos and talks, my concern is when the findings of science become compromised or captured by the demonic or daimonic-like tangle web of institutional imperatives in our cultures and nations and corporations and things. That looks to me like giving a loaded revolver to a psychopath or a sociopath or someone who's catastrophically developmentally disabled. I could make further hyperboles, giving the button that launches the nuclear weapons to somebody who's completely incoherent, cognitively drunk, and likes to push buttons. So that the results of science in our modern milieu and situation, I find deeply disturbing, if not and terrifying. But the method itself is fascinating and brilliant, or the array of methods. There was a false abstraction there. Mathematics appears to be a behavior that's natural to human beings. And to have questions about the nature of time, light, matter, organisms, relationships, genes, viruses, bacteria, animals, plants, living places, and so on. These are natural curiosities that can find expression in a scientific context. Now, it's true that modern science is compromised in all kinds of ways by the cultures and institutions that largely dominate its activity, by money, the desire for power, military might, profit, and so on. And these are the wrong things to place in the driver's seat of the vehicle of our human scientific capacities. When I was young, science was presented as a messianic it was presented in a messianic role. It would save us from war and poverty and disease, isolation, catastrophic capitalism, so on. This didn't turn out to happen. It's not surprising. There were no societies, and there are no societies intelligent enough to make wise use of the findings of science. So it would seem to me that our first priority as human beings must be to establish such societies by whatever means we can reasonably employ. And of course, this is relatively easy at a small scale, 2 people, 5 people. This can happen. But the large-scale stuff is incredibly momentous and well-established and highly structured. So the only way to go after that stuff is to produce something so astonishingly beautiful, humane, and intelligent that nobody wants to be left out. And that's an accessible goal, however unlikely it may seem. Now, when I talk about my problems with abstraction and with the over-authorization, in some cases, of scientific findings, I'm concerned when I speak about abstractions mostly with a kind of linguistic behavior that's related to set theoretical problems and errors and what we might even call contagious diseases of generalization and believing abstractions in language that aren't only unlikely, they're impossible. And speaking and thinking in these ways that amputate the possibilities of our intelligence. But I was speaking with a friend of mine this afternoon who's a scientist, and we were talking about topics related to quantum physics and the divide between quantum physics and relativity, which seems to occur from some perspectives right at the place where entanglement becomes a topic of concern. Though there's other ways to point out the problems that keep us from unifying quantum physics and relativity. It's one of the great tasks of the modern age in science. Or rather, I should say, in physics research, right? I should limit the scope. So we were talking about this, and we were talking about a particular mathematician, Stanislaw Ulam, and what happened when he got a brain disease and was trapped in the hospital for a long time and became bored. And that's kind of a joke because one of the towering figures in the mathematical pursuit of physics was Niels Bohr. A very troubling and somewhat tyrannical figure. In any case, Stanley Ulam, who was soon to go and work on the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, got a brain infection and had to go to the hospital. And because he was very bored, he started playing solitaire. And as he was playing, he was, in his mind, doing a sort of complex math involving the permutations of 52 cards, which is the number 52 squared. And what he was trying to do was, with each iteration of play, he was trying to determine in his mind something like the probability of this hand that he was playing succeeding. And as he proceeded with each iteration of play, the field of numeric structure that he was holding in his mind to compute not just the probable outcomes but the possible outcomes too would shrink a little bit with each iteration of play. And eventually, after doing this for a while, apparently, according to my friend Kevin, he produced an abstraction which was a limited subset of the entire field of possibility and probability that was efficaciously limited. Instead of having to entertain all the possibilities and probabilities and all of the numeric data, he found that there was a useful subset that was sufficient to the task without being explicitly complete. And this is an example of a profoundly useful abstraction in science. And it's an abstraction that's important in Schrödinger's wave equations. as I understood my friend to explain, I'm not an expert on this topic or these matters, the introduction of psi, which I think is PSI, it's a symbol in math, to the equations introduces to the equation an efficacious subset of something that might be phase spaces, where instead of having to consider everything, almost literally, the entire phase space, one can produce an efficacious subset that is effectively good enough without being complete. And this is extremely important. It's a limitation of scope. Instead of having all the data, we take as much of the data as is necessary and no more. Because if we have to take all the data, we have to include everything. Every interaction of every particle or quantum element in all of time. So in scientific pursuits, abstraction is fundamentally important, and it allows us to make useful limitations of scope. Another example would be if we want to determine the function of, let's say, of hemoglobin or some amino acid or some hormone, we first start out with some guesses and some observations, and then so that will begin the process of abstraction, and then we may have some specific concerns. Under what cases are malfunctions in hemoglobin or quantifications of hemoglobin problematical for human health, or lead to disease, or lead to healing, or so on. So that's a further limitation of scope. Because if we have to know what hemoglobin is fundamentally, we will fail. Science is not, generally, scientific research is not concerned so much with identity, what things fundamentally are. And it doesn't answer metaphysical questions about origin or nature or essence or any of these things. If we want to chase those questions, we can make progress with scientific methods, and those can be incredibly informative in our pursuits, but their limitations will catch up to us and we'll get stuck. In order to know what everything is, we may first have to know what something is. And this kind of knowledge is transcendental, not scientific. Though science may concern itself with utility, the function of discernible, distinguishable elements within some discernible or distinguishable scope or context. So science, quote unquote, isn't in the business of telling us what things are, though some people are confused about this. Mostly science is usually concerned with function and relationship in a limited scope of context. So I want to make it clear that in no way am I anti-science. I read scientists and mathematicians with some regularity. I'm fascinated by the work and their findings. But those, for me, get fed into deeper questions about the nature of life, light, time, identity, origin, essence. And I certainly have a vast array of concerns that are transcendental to logic or rationality or science or representational cognition. And we could call some of these metaphysical, though that term's become very value-laden in our time. I'm not sure if it ever wasn't. By the time we could use the term metaphysical, we had been divided cognitively from the experiences, feelings, and behaviors that prior to the possibility of employing such a term were natural to human beings all over the world in all of time, and are still natural to human beings, but have been captured by things like religion and philosophy and so on, and science to some degree. So I want to make it clear that, first of all, there are many crucial domains in which abstraction and our intellect are important. Even in simple, pragmatic, day-to-day behaviors like driving a car or a bicycle. We have to have enough predictive awareness to be able to identify and respond to threats and opportunities. And this involves both intellect, intuition, some degree of the biological behaviors that resemble computation, but which computation is a derivative of. Computation has a lesser scope and mode than these behaviors. So we shouldn't confuse these behaviors with computation. Their scope is much broader and based in things that computation cannot capture, like somatic awareness, body awareness. The feeling in our body, the hyperstructure of cellular intelligence that our bodies and minds emerge from, instant to instant. All kinds of things that not only do we ordinarily not take into account, we have no ways of knowing capable of taking these into account. At least no formal ways. Though, of course, we have people who wear the vocational label somatic practitioner. These are people who we might think of as body whisperers, if they're good, or as charlatans if they suck, or are coercive or manipulative, or are in the grip of some library of narratives that actually are leading them away from the body under the flag of championing our somatic aspects. And this is the other problem that we face. There are thousands of pretenders everywhere. Once we have a concept, 8 predators will pick up this flag and start running around with it. Thankfully, some sincere, authentic, empathic people whose awareness is deep and altruistic also pick up such flags. And the situation is very complex. These are continua, not polarities. These are spectrums of degrees of different things in many layers, topologically, rather than either this person is sincere or they are a predator. And this is another problem with abstraction that we have. We do it in ways that are so clumsy and crude that they not only immediately mislead us, they guarantee that we can only continue to be misled by them. So these are concerns that I have with these issues. But as a way of knowing, science offers us the capacity to form insights that are otherwise impossible. And those insights need not be fundamentally authoritative, but anyone who's concerned about the nature of being or the other important questions would be unwise to evict science or scientific findings, is actually a better way of putting it, the findings of specific forms of research and concern. Because those findings give us a specific mode of information and knowledge that is invaluable as long as we don't take it as explicit or entirely authoritative. And the fact that in our modern situation scientific behavior can be captured or mispurposed does not, again, give us any good reason to evict it. This is a very deep and important way of knowing, worth including in our library. Again, it will bring us the capacity for insights that are otherwise impossible. And much of scientific research and behavior has to do with seeing the unseeable. Now, a very deep solar mind might have the intuition that something is being passed from generation to generation in organisms. But it's very unlikely that without direct biological research, they would invent the idea of DNA and then locate it in the cell bodies. Science is most useful when we, first of all, understand how to read it, how to read research papers, what p-values are, what error bars mean, the capacity to think of the scope of the experimental context, how well it matches its concerns, and which loopholes it's included or overlooked. I have some capacity to read scientific research as I work in the field in a relatively modest way, but for many years now, with my friend Kevin, who is a neuroscientist and a molecular biologist. So for the common person who's not trained or hasn't yet developed the modest skills required to read a scientific paper well, they have to depend on abstractions and derivations primarily from the media, and most of those are wildly untrustworthy and use language that makes us dumber every time we encounter it. I saw an article the other day that said something like, songbirds make us happy according to science. This is a linguistic error that presents science as a human speaker and all of science instead of, the headline could have been slightly more accurate if it said, some researchers have discovered a link between hearing songbirds and happiness, although quantifying happiness could be a relatively difficult chore scientifically. Science isn't a speaker. Science doesn't have a voice. It's a generalization of the entire range of scientific research and behavior since the inception of science. And science as we understand it today is quite young, however seemingly advanced its methods and findings may appear. So we're often wrong-footed immediately when we think of science as a thing by itself. What actually exists are methods, experiments, research, findings, and publications. Of course, also technologies. I'm glad that the methods exist. that the findings exist, that this way of knowing exists and is enacted. I think it's tragic. The results of its inaction in the context in which it exists are tragic. It's the kind of a tool that serves an intelligent society very well and serves mimetic society catastrophically. But that's not the fault of the way of knowing. When we think of science, we should think of something incredibly vast, a jungle of astonishing variety, unencompassable, even by the word science. Impossible to wrap our minds around. That word includes all the possible branches, all the experiments, all the research, good and bad. That's a very diffuse thing, a very ambiguous thing. And when faced with ambiguity, our common habits do not serve us well. But the capacity for humans to look, for example, at a population of people, a cohort, say 100,000 people, and track specific variables within this cohort over time, and then look at the relative outcomes in health, well-being, behavior, and so on. This is very powerful, for it gives us insight into the otherwise unseeable. I think science is probably the grandchild of myth, which is one way of not using the word metaphysics. And it tends to despise its own origin in this sense and say, no, we are the grandchild of logic and rationality, or the child of logic and rationality. There's some truth in both perspectives. However, metaphysical speculations, what is the universe doing? Who is the universe? Who are the people of the universe? These questions led to the eventual onset of rationality and logic, and the birth of science as we understand it today. One of the features we see in medical science is a similar limitation of efficacious scope. Now, the more diverse our cohort, the blurrier our findings become. If we take our 100,000 people randomly from nations all over the world, we're going to introduce novelty that's hard to control for or capture in our research. If we only look at people in a single city, we're going to do the opposite thing. We're going to introduce limitations of scope that can be deceptive in terms of findings. So the negotiation of scope and diversity of cohort are very important features of good science, science that's done well. As we've seen with COVID, there are radical divergences in statistics depending on which cohort we select, how we select our cohorts, and their geographical location, their genetic lineages, and so on. And this is in part because each human being is extremely unique, even though human beings share qualities and properties that we can abstract and derive from research. For this reason, statistics can't tell us what happens to an individual or a very small cohort. As the cohort size shrinks, the efficacy of the statistics shrink with it, and they become negligible at fairly small sizes. It's amazing how important the idea that I point to with this word scope is in thought, research, evaluation, prediction, analysis, and explanation. This is where the error most often gets made, or where many errors most often arise. Ineffective employment or understanding or awareness of scope. And this is the problem that we all face, or a problem that we all face in our common thought and evaluative activity. We can't tell which pieces to include and which ones to exclude. And also we are probably biased in a variety of ways. We're more easily biased by two opposing forms of perception. One is threat. The felt sense of a threat can cause us to misapply scope dramatically, so that, for example, what would be a good example? Since a broken bone is a very bad thing, somebody who's having pain in their shin and is anxious in general and under stress could begin to think, oh, I must have broken my shin. But the other, the sort of flip side of that is opportunity and affinity. And this is how advertising works. Advertising works by capturing, well, usually both variables, threat and opportunity. But primarily, advertising and con games function by biasing us against the statistics to believe in opportunities that are either very unlikely or don't exist at all. Similarly, advertising and things like news, media, television, and so on bias us to see things that are going on in the world at large as personal threats or problems, when most of the time they aren't. And in fact have nearly nothing to do with us personally. And again, our chances of affecting them personally are usually vanishingly small, with some important exceptions. When I presented this concern to my friend Holly, she decided to push back and said, you know, most people think they can't really affect the situation in the Ukraine, but a group of people, including the owner of Airbnb, got together and began renting Airbnbs in the Ukraine as a way to get money directly to Ukrainian citizens. This was a good example of a small group of intelligent people using the existing infrastructure to accomplish something beautiful without analyzing, you know, the degree of its success or failure. Just recognizing, oh, you know, these structures that are in place, these daimons in our societies and cultures, they can be captured too by us. We can capture them for purposes that are altruistic and noble and intelligent when we're thinking openly enough about the nature and function of the structures underlying institutions like nations and corporations and so on. So I wanted to rebalance some of my recent discussions about my concerns about intellect and abstraction and include into the equation some of the ways in which they're absolutely important and powerful and beautiful. We do them all the time when we select food, when we prepare food, when we get dressed, when we clean our homes. All of these things involve intellect and abstraction, right? At some point, the house is in good shape, right? We look at it and we go, yes, this is in good shape. At another point, we realize, this is not in good shape. This needs attention. That's an abstraction, right? We're making a derivative analysis of a situation. So we use these things all the time, and in our ordinary lives, when they are good, they are good. When they are neutral, they are neutral. When they deceive us and lead us into delusion and suffering and tragedy, then we should have a concern about their scope and our grasp of them, and how and when we employ them, and how and when we resist them, so that there is balance and harmony in our thought and our thought-inspired behavior. For today, I think I will end there. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again sometime soon. Bye-bye for now.